So today's video is going to be pretty different from most of my other content, but it is going to have a fun kind of blind A/B testing to look at kind of if there's a real difference between string gauges or not. And this video kind of came about because of something I was curious about in my own playing journey. And I decided I'd document the results, and it would be potentially of interest to some of you watching. So I, for the last year or so, have been using D'Addario's XL strings, and I've been using their stock kind of medium jazz gauge, which is a 56 to 13 set. And I kind of got there. A lot of jazz players tend to favor thicker strings, and in particular, I really liked when I bumped up to 13s that the unwound strings, so if you're using strings that thick in standard tuning, typically you have a wound G string. And I really liked that it had a 17 B string and a 13 E string. I found that it gave those notes a little bit more kind of roundedness versus maybe being a little bit thinner and twangy with you know, I was using 12s for years before that, and then before that I was using 11s. It's kind of progressively gone up. But one thing that I've noticed with a lot of my favorite modern jazz guitarists, like guys like Tom Allendorf and Gilad Hekselman, and just a lot of jazz guitarists in general, they really love Thomastic strings. And I've always kind of toyed with the idea of using Thomastic strings, but the problem with Thomastic strings, for me at least, is that they are about 40 Canadian dollars a set, which is more than I'm willing to pay for guitar strings. But the interesting thing about the Thomastic strings is that when I was looking into them, they actually had quite a bit lighter gauges on the other strings. So for comparison, I have my notes over here. The D'Addarios go 13, 17, 26, 36, 46, and 56. And the thing that I found with 13s is that sometimes when I'm in situations like last year, I did a national tour. When I was on that tour, when I was using gear that wasn't, you know, my home setup that I have dialed in, when I'm using house amps or running through PAs, I found that sometimes the lower voices of my chords were getting kind of woofy and full, whereas the Thomastic gauge strings are 13, 17, so same on the unwound strings, but then 21 versus 26 on the wound G string. 30 versus 36 on the wound D string, 38 versus 46 on the A string. And then Thomastics use 53s rather than 56s, but D'Addario doesn't sell single set 53s of their XL strings, so I ended up getting a 52, and that gives away the next bit of this test, is that I used, I ordered single strings from D'Addario, enough to make 3 sets of strings, in the Thomastic gauges. And the thing that I was curious to see about that is if it decreased some of that woofiness that I was finding when I was playing, you know, particularly in the lower register of the guitar. See if I could get a little bit more note definition there without, you know, stepping on my bassist's toes. And so what's about to follow is I'm going to do the first time I play through these examples, it's going to be totally blind. And then I'll tell you what they are and kind of tell you my thoughts between them. On the chord melody examples, I'm also going to show you in Logic the EQ profile of each of these live with the take, so that you can kind of get an idea and see what's happening. All of the audio that you hear of me playing in those videos has no alterations done. It's all done through my Line 6 Helix, the same patch, no settings tweaked, running through a Scarlett 2i2 into Logic, and in Logic I did absolutely no processing other than obviously putting the EQ on it so you can follow the bands. So here I'm going to do the blind test of A versus B, and you can think whether they're the thicker low strings of the D'Addario stock set or the thicker strings of the still D'Addario but Thomastic gauge set. And so there's going to be an example of chordal playing, an example of a single note line, and an example of a kind of chord melody type thing. So if you want to play along with the game, let me know which you think is which down in the comments before you finish the rest of the video. But go forth and check out these quick little examples here. So in that comparison, the Tomastic gauge strings were example A, and the D'Addario stock 13 set was example B. And I'm curious to know whether you thought the same thing as I did, is that I find that with the Tomastic gauge strings, there's a little bit more brightness and chiminess, particularly again on the wound strings. The notes are a little bit more kind of clear and crisp, whereas I find on the thicker strings, it's a little bit more almost like a tubbiness to it, which again can be a very desirable sound. Neither is better or worse, but I've actually really been enjoying. I've left the Tomastic gauge single string sets that I ordered from D'Addario on this guitar, and I absolutely love them. I think they may be my new normal, but we'll see what happens. I was quite surprised looking at the EQs of each of these that there wasn't, at least on the graphs, there isn't a ton of difference between the two. I did notice that on the D'Addario stock 13s that there was maybe, when there were things coming up kind of in the lower register around 100 hertz, those tended to be a little bit louder of a jump than on the thinner gauge strings. But again, in the actual EQ, I didn't see a ton of difference between the two. But it was interesting because when I played them for my fiance, who is not very musically inclined and doesn't have the vocabulary to describe these things, she actually picked up on the same thing, that the second example was a little bit tubbier and more bass heavy, almost like there's a thunk to it, which again makes sense. But for me, I've been getting really into trying to play with a little bit lighter of a touch, and also having I love when people play with the kind of stereotypical tone knob rolled down jazz sound like Jim Hall's tones and stuff like that, but that's not really the voice that I hear in my head when I'm playing the guitar. So I really, really like, from the sonic perspective, that it's a little bit less thunky, and it's got a little bit more of a clear kind of sound. And then from an actual touch perspective, it's been really interesting playing these thinner gauge strings, because again, I always felt like maybe the D'Addarios, well, I shouldn't say I always felt like it, but in thinking about them and using them for the last year or 2 years, those 13s, I always thought that maybe the bottom end of the guitar was a little bit too thick, whereas keeping those unwound strings the same gauge, that thickness really helps kind of, I think, balance the sound and the tonal characteristics of everything. So yeah, I think this set, so again, I'm running a 52 on the bottom, is the only difference from the Tomastic set. If you're interested in trying something similar to this, there are websites like Stringjoy that let you order custom sets of strings. For me, unfortunately, as a Canadian, I get charged some pretty heavy shipping things. So for me, what I did is I just went on Player Circle on D'Addario and custom ordered single strings of each of these gauges. So again, I'm running a 13, 17, 21, 30, 38, and then 52. And these are all round wound. They're the standard XL strings. This has been something that's been super interesting for me to try out, and so far, again, I'm really liking the results. It helps me play with a little bit softer of a touch on the lower strings because they're a little bit less thick. And again, I'm finding that when I go into the low end of the guitar, I'm getting a little bit less of a big kind of boom from them. Again, not super represented on the frequency graph, looking at the EQ, but again, it was perceptible to me and even my fiance, who does not play guitar or really spend time worrying about such things. So let me know what you thought in the comments, if you heard something there. I hope you enjoyed this test and my ramblings on these string gauges. It's something that I've always been curious about, and it's now something that I think I'm going to be sticking with. So if you enjoyed the video, I'd really appreciate it if you could like and subscribe. It truly helps me out more than you know. If you want to check out my video course on triads or my book all about scales and arpeggios, there's links to that down in the comments. There's also a link to support me in the channel on Patreon, so you can get early access to videos if you feel so inclined. If you want to take a guitar lesson with me, I have a link to that as well. I'd love to work with you on whatever's troubling you on the guitar. And last but not least, as always, I'll wish you a wonderful day, and I hope you get to have some fun playing the guitar. Thank you so much for watching.